Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm Hannah and this is Bookshelvish. So today what we're going to be doing is going through my top 10 reads of 2024, and I had a really hard time narrowing it down to 10, but they are all ranked. So along with those, I also have 8 unranked honorable mentions. So we're going to kind of dive into that first. I am going to do my very best to keep this completely free of spoilers, so just so you're aware of that. This should be safe to watch. However, if you have any desire to read these books, I would say, obviously, check the synopsis, check trigger warnings, that kind of thing. That's not what I'm here for. Okay, so jumping right in. The very first book I'm going to talk about today is Powerless by Lauren Roberts. I think for me, the vibes were just perfect for this book. It's chock full of romantasy tropes that I love, and I think there's a lot of romantasies out there right now that are doing very similar things, and I don't really think this was an exception, but that's not a bad thing. I think it's really evident how much Lauren Roberts, the author, just absolutely loves romantasy and had fun writing this and loves her characters. But I think if you're looking for something that's like completely unique, probably not your book. I also think this speaks to how much your actual reading experience can influence what you rate a book, because at the time, I think if I had read this at a different time, it would not have hit the same way. But as it stands, I was obsessed. I went on to reading Powerful, which I thought was okay, and then I read Reckless, which I know has some bad press, but I thought it was awesome. But that's Powerless by Lauren Roberts. Next up, we have The Vows by Jessica Joyce. I loved these characters so much. I'm also a Northern California native, so I think Jessica Joyce's books just hit differently because I feel like I'm there. I think Jessica Joyce is also really similar in feel to Abby Jimenez in that it's like a fun rom-com with like lots of banter, but there's also stuff. And so it has that more weighty feel to it that a lot of romances don't. And so because of that, it really just touched a part of my soul. I can't even explain it. It's interesting too because I don't usually love second chance romance. It's okay, but it's not one of my favorite tropes, which is funny because I am married to a second chance romance. I would say that because she's an auto-buy author for me, this is only her second book, but You with a View was fantastic. We'll talk about it a little bit later in the video, but this was just perfect. If you've read this, you know the grand gesture at the end freaking broke me. I want to like cry just thinking about it. And if you've read this before, you know what I'm talking about. So that is The Vows by Jessica Joyce. Next honorable mention is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. I am not a thriller girly. I am a huge baby. I get freaked out super easily. I am not the person you want on your team in a zombie apocalypse. I will scream and die very quickly. That being said, I tried this because a lot of people rave about it. It's YA, so I figured even the thrillery aspect was probably going to be okay. And then also the TV show is coming out, so I wanted to, you know, have background or whatever because I am one of those people that you can't watch the movie before you read the book. Oh, and this is all really funny because I love the book. I gave it 5 stars, but I was really so-so on the Netflix show. I've heard there's 2 different versions of this book. I read the American one and I loved it. I mean, I have a couple of British friends who said Pip's character was completely different, and so maybe that's true. I haven't read both, so I can't really compare, but I loved Pip in this. I'm also obsessed with Ravi, and I think this is just the perfect example of why I love YA still. A lot of people don't, and they say that YA is too mature for them, which I get, but I am not mature enough to feel so far removed from what's going on here. That's A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. Next honorable mention is Sable Peak by Devney Perry. This is book number 6, the last one in the Eden series, so do not read this one before you read the other 5, otherwise this one will be spoiled. Also, a moment for the cover. It's beautiful. So our main male character is Mateo. And I don't know why, but I have this inexplicable thing for bush pilots ever since reading the Simple Wild series. And so as soon as I knew he was a bush pilot, I could not wait for his book. I was like, we need this man in our lives ASAP. I thought the beginning was slow, but once we got into the action and a couple of the like random time jumps, I really fell in love with this story, and I loved him and Vera's relationship way more than I thought I would based off of how those characters developed for, you know, the previous couple of books. I'm also, of course, a sucker for a single dad trope because is anyone not? Highly recommend this one, but really the Eden series as a whole. So that is Sable Peak by Devney Perry. Next up we have The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. posted. I don't know what I expected with this read, but it exceeded all of my expectations. I think a large part of that was just, again, right book, right time. I am really close with my dad, and so I loved that aspect of it. But I also, you know, similar to Florence, moved out when I was relatively young. I was 17 when I left for college, and I've never moved back in full time since. And I'm a middle child, older sister, younger brother, and so there's this degree of connection that I felt with Florence, our female main character, that I just don't have with books very often. And so this broke me in like a good way. I'm also not normally a magical realism fan, but this killed it for some reason, and I really didn't think that it would end up in a good direction. It had me at like 4 stars all the way through to like the last maybe like 15 to 20%, and then I just, oof, chef's kiss, fell in love. That is The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. I don't know if you guys saw this slipping out, but my friend Stephanie sent me this book, so that's what was falling out of the cover. I usually tape these in, but didn't. Next up for honorable mentions is The Ballad of Never After by Stephanie Garber. This is the second book in the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy, so I'm not going to say too much by way of like what happens in it because of spoilers, but I love Jax even in the Caraval series, and his development in this book was amazing. So I would say if you have read Caraval, and I do think you should read that whole trilogy before Once Upon a Broken Heart, because you'll spoil things for yourself if you don't. I loved his character in that series, even though he was kind of a douche canoe, and in this one it just gets better. I also think Evangeline as a female main character is just something else, and she hits different because she goes against this classical romantic-y girly vibe of being this intense badass who has like been through, you know, the absolute toilet and like knows how to shoot arrows or how to knock a guy out with one punch, or how to survive in the wilderness with nothing but like a dagger or something like that. Evangeline likes pink, and she wants to hang out and she wants to find love, and she's not afraid of that being a major part of her journey. And I think it's just a prime example of inner strength not translating to being a badass biatch who doesn't take anything from anybody type character. Yeah, I do think she serves some I can fix him energy that I could do without, but at the end of the day, love her. As a final note, the world building in this whole series is impeccable. You've never read anything like it. So that is The Ballad of Never After by Stephanie Garber. Next honorable mention is A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. This is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. It has a really wonderful disability representation and really creative world building and like a bit of a love triangle. Not quite a full love triangle, it's like a tension triangle. And if there's one thing about me, I love a love triangle. I know that's not a popular trope. I'm obsessed with it. This was my first book by this author, and now I'm obsessed with her. I can't wait to read everything that she writes, and she's also somewhat local to me, which is really fun because I always find signed copies of Barnes & Noble, signed copies of her books at, you know, local Barnes & Nobles and stuff, which is a great time. This is technically YA, but I don't think it reads as like too YA, if that makes sense. The main character is Harper. She's not whiny, she's not irritating, she's not just making poor decisions left and right. She's a really smart, capable girl, and I think that's really fun to see in a YA particularly. And that is A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. Our final runner-up is Gleam by Raven Kennedy. This is the third book in the Plated Prisoner series. I fell in love with the series in November and just binged the entire thing. And these are like thick books. This is one of the thinner ones, and it's still a chunker. So there's a reveal immediately after, or like at the very end of book 2 that I kind of saw coming, but I was really curious how in book 3 that was going to wrap up and kind of play out, we'll say. I ate it up. There is tension and yearning and romance, and the slow burn is so real, but it pays off incredibly. And as a note, like, I will say that I don't think this series is perfect, and I don't think it's for everyone, and there's a lot of people who I normally align really well with their book taste, and they didn't like this series or thought it was, you know, average, as I'm over here like choking myself with it because I'm eating it up so fast. But I did love the whole thing and tore through them. I think don't start them until you're in a place where you can really just binge. I started the first one and read it cover to cover on the flight back from my honeymoon, and then from there I was like, all right, we're just gonna full speed ahead on this thing because that's where I'm at. Highly recommend if you're looking for something fun. This is kind of, I would say, like an ACOTAR Zodiac Academy combo. So with all the like addiction, I guess, of Zodiac Academy with like things that actually make sense in ACOTAR. Maybe a little bit too long. Maybe we could have cut it down a little bit. Do with that what you will. But that's Gleam by Raven Kennedy. Okay, And now that we did honorable mentions, let's jump into my top 10. So starting with number 10 is Glow of the Everflame. This book is number 2 in the Kindred Curses series, starting with Spark of the Everflame. So with these, I think I'm not going to give you guys a synopsis because you can go look that up, and otherwise this video is going to be 1,000 miles long. I read this in October. There's another series that I read the first one and just binged all the way through. I was annoyed with DM the whole time in this, but I loved Luther. He's really what made this book what it is. There was pining, there was tension, there was this slow burn that just burned. And Luther's just hot, is really what it comes down to. DM had like huge idiot energy for this entire book, and so she was really frustrating to read from like her perspective at times, because I was like, sis, what are you doing with the stupid mortal man? Not to give you spoilers or anything. So there was something of a, I wouldn't even call it a love triangle necessarily, because it's clear who is coming out on top. This pesky once was relationship kind of hung around, and I despise that portion of it, but I see why it was necessary for the story. So, you know, it did what it needed to do. One thing I'll say about this is that it does end on a huge cliffhanger. So if you're going to read this one, I recommend having Heat of the Everflame ready to go immediately after. I didn't end up liking that one as much as this one. This one is all of the stars. So that's Glow of the Everflame by Penn Cole. Okay, next, number 9. This book is The Wren in the Holly Library by K.A. Lind. I loved this book. So I read this in August. I didn't really know what it was about. I pretty much went in blind. I feel like I've only seen mid to poor reviews of this book, and like, respectfully, I don't know who hurt those people, because this was brilliant. It's kind of based around Celtic mythology, which is one of my really like niche interests because I'm 98% Irish. And so I haven't read a lot of books that incorporate that. And so I thought just that element of it made it really interesting. But then you combine like Beauty and the Beast with like sort of a Selena Sardothian vibe, hot Irishmen slash like deities slash like mortals or humans or whatever they're called, and like an apocalyptic monster-ridden New York City, and I am apparently so there. So right now I'm showing you the Fairy Loot edition of this cover, but the original regularly published version is so beautiful too. This one has those really pretty spreads and like a really gorgeous end papers. I don't know if you can see that. So even if this book wasn't good, it's freaking gorgeous. So I would say try it out if you're into romantasy at all. And that's The Wren in the Holly Library by K.A. Lind. Number 8 is Juniper Hill by Devney Perry. The 6th book in this series was in my honorable mentions, Sable Peak. This book is number 2. Again, read them in order, please. Yeah, I read this in March. A couple of my friends and I were doing a buddy read of the whole series. This is definitely my favorite of all of them, but Sable Peak is a really, really, really close second. This one has a single mom trope, and she is into this like hot chef. There need to be more books about hot chefs. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not as over the moon about the grumpy sunshine trope as a lot of people, but this book really did it so well. If you've read it, you know, but the quote, "Mine is a night owl," sent me into like hysterics. I started crying. So yeah, if you enjoy romantic suspense that's very light on the suspense, I would pick up the Edens for sure. That's Juniper Hill by Devney Perry. Coming in at number 7. Okay, this book is so special to me. This is You with a View by Jessica Joyce. This is her debut, which is crazy. I love the cover, first of all. It's beautiful. I would say, so I read this in January and I already knew it was going to be a top book of the year. I would say this is like beach read meets Letters to Juliet, and it was incredible. I love both of those. Well, the movie and the book. One of my niche like catnip tropes is a road trip. The one in here is through like the southwestern United States, and I've literally been on that exact road trip like a year before I read this. So having that like visual in mind while they're hitting all of these places that I stopped at, and then it ends in Lake Tahoe, which is about an hour away from me. I was supposed to get married there in the fall, and so obviously know it super well. It just checked all of the boxes that like the perfect Hannah book would check. And on top of that, I just related so much to our female main character, whose name is escaping me, Noelle Shepherd. Highly recommend this one. I don't want to give too much detail for fear of spoilers, but basically Noelle's in like a really bad place. Her grandma passes away. She's going through her stuff and finds this old picture of her grandma's flame that no one knew anything about, and she ends up kind of recreating this trip that her grandma and this old flame went on. Super cute. There's like kind of a rivals to lovers sort of vibe to it, and yeah, I highly recommend this book. That's You with a View by Jessica Joyce. Okay, Number 6 is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. This is obviously the Fairy Loot edition, but the normal one is beautiful also. I don't really know how to describe this book because there's a lot going on in it. This is some of the most intricate world building that I have seen in a romantasy. I would say if you like romantasy, but you're more on the side of I like romance rather than I like fantasy, this is probably not going to be a book that works for you. There's a glossary in the front that's like quite a few pages just to get you familiarized with the world. I thought it was really well done, but I could see how people would be like, let's get to the point. Where is the point? So there's like 18 different interwoven plot points. You're going kind of back and forth between time periods, POVs. There's just so much that happens in this book, but I'd say if you like fantasy with some romance in it, read this one. I would say that some of the tropes that are in here are what I would call like predictable, but I still think they're done really well and it doesn't take away from the story. And then the one other thing I would say about this is that the dragon element is like a lot more minimal than I think you would expect based off of the cover. There's a dragon on the traditionally published one too, but I still really liked that aspect of it. But if you're coming off of Fourth Wing and you're thinking, I want another book that is exactly like that, this is not it, but it's amazing in its own unique way. Okay, number 5. I read this one in April, but I've really been reading it for like 6 months. This is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. This is, I don't know who doesn't know what Outlander is at this point, but this is set in the Scottish Highlands. It's like a time travel romance / historical fiction. This book was a roller coaster. It took me 5 months to read it, and it's not because it wasn't good. It's just dense. Each of these pages is like got pretty small font on it. There's actually more words in this than there are in Kingdom of Ash, and so I think just the length was really daunting to me when I picked it up. I would say Jamie Fraser is like joining the ranks of my top MMCs of all time, and Claire's a really incredible lead. I would say Scotland is another like niche feature of a book that I just eat right up. So if you set anything in Scotland, I'm reading it. It was the destination of my first ever international trip. I just got back from my honeymoon there a few months ago, and I have just a special affinity for it that made me really excited to read this one, and it did deliver. I have not started book 2. I've read like 2 pages of it. It's called Dragonfly and Amber, but I am scared of it. So someone tell me if I should read it. But that is my number 5 book, Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. Number 4 is Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kemmerer. I have not seen this one anywhere. I'd not heard of it from anyone on Bookstagram, on BookTube, no one. But I did find it at Barnes & Noble, saw that it was Bridget Kemmerer that wrote it. We talked about A Curse So Dark and Lonely in my honorable mentions. I love her writing, so I picked it up. I don't love the cover either, so I'm not really sure how it caught my eye, but it did. This is a young adult romance, but it's so much more than that. I think the closest book I could give you as a read-alike would be The Dead Romantics. I was not dealing really with a season of grief this year, so I don't know why I read so many books that were so sad and about death, but it was really good. So I started and finished this book in about 4 hours, and I was bawling by the end of it to the point where my husband was actually like genuinely concerned about me. I would say some highlights are the depiction of grief, the like letter writing that was going on in this book. I love a letter writing trope. The innocence and yet depth of like feeling behind these 2 characters was something that you don't get in a lot of books. There was also a lot of adoption and foster care rep, which is something that's really close to my heart. This one also did a really great job of depicting adult parenting figures who struggle with depression, alcoholism, like a lot of issues on their own, infidelity, like parenting insecurity, all of these things that I think we don't really get a great look at in a lot of YA books. Yeah, I would compare this to Divine Rivals meets The Dead Romantics. Mashup, like without magic and just a sprinkle of Give Me the Sun and like Rainbow Rowell. That's a lot of things to mash up, but it was perfect. Also, any book that includes Invictus is clearly a win. And that's Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kemmerer. Number 3 is Running Wild by K.A. Tucker. I almost don't even know how to talk about this book. I'd give it 6 stars if it were an option. Again, this is number 3. I was really apprehensive about this book because it is the 4th in the Simple Wild series, but it's the first book that's not about Calla and Jonah. And I was obsessed on another level with Calla and Jonah. The Simple Wild was one of my top books last year in 2023. So this one, perfection. But we do shift perspectives and main characters, so I was nervous about that. But I ended up loving this book so much. I also think one of my niche interests, I've already said, is like Alaska, but particularly like dog sleds. Now, I gotta go. So partially inspired by this book, my husband and I are going on an Alaskan cruise in a couple of months, and I'm so excited. I don't normally do well in series when there's a main character shift. Like, I know other people feel differently. I am not a Court of Silver Flames girly. I preferred Farrah and Rhysand, and so having that pivot always just makes me nervous. But I think Marie is just such an endearing character in her own right. Even though I didn't like her in the rest of the series, she's sitting back and like watching life happen to everybody around her and feeling like she's never going to get what she wants out of life or love or her career or anything like that. I know she's not real, but I think being with her for that experience is one of the more healing things that I've ever read. And I hope that anyone who is reading it knows that you're never behind on anything, and neither is she, that her life was happening exactly when it was supposed to. She found who she was meant to be with at a time when it made sense and not when she really wanted to make it happen. And sitting here reading this, knowing that I felt that way for so long, and now I'm, you know, happily married to someone who I thought was going to be out of my life forever, it just really struck a chord with me. And so I would really recommend this book if you've read the other 3 Simple Wild books and you're thinking, shoot, I didn't really like Marie, I don't know that Running Wild is for me. It's for you. That is Running Wild by K.A. Tucker. All right, last 2. My number 2 book of the year is Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. I read this in June, and I actually could barely type up my thoughts afterwards because I couldn't see through my tears for like several minutes. This is like Part of Your World meets Beach Read, I would say, in like the best way, and those are 2 of my favorite romance books, so that says a lot. As someone with a biological family that I've never met and some other really personal similarities to Emma, I related with this book a lot more than I have with a lot of other books I've read. I will say this is the 3rd in the Part of Your World series, so it goes Part of Your World, Yours Truly, then this one. Do not read this one without reading the other 2 first. People will tell you you can do it out of order. You should not. Obviously, everyone can read whatever way they want, but that's just my 2 cents. If you're thinking about reading this book, know that this is not a rom-com. It has a lot of stuff and like triggers in it for things that I think aren't often covered in a lot of books. And so just, you know, read with care. I think this book changed my perspective on boundaries a lot, especially with family members who want a lot more from you than you have to give. I'll probably be processing this book forever, but I can see myself rereading it a ton. So that's Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. Whew, now we have my top book of the year. This one I've seen all over the place. I think it's appropriately hyped. It is incredible. I read this in March and then I reread it again in December, which actually for me that says a lot because I usually have a rule for myself for no particular reason that I don't reread the same or the book in the same year that I've already read it, so I try to do rereads in separate years. This has all of my favorite tropes: enemies to lovers, love triangles, hot brothers, secret seduction quests, and this book is Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli? Ciccarelli? I don't know. Sorry, Kristen, this author. I read this in March and it sat at my top read spot for the entire year, and it's kind of the book that I measured everything else against. I basically binged this in one day. It was on St. Patrick's Day. I was at my mother-in-law's house. I distinctly remember this. Just sat on the couch in this book. I am so ready for Rebel Witch that it is crazy. It's probably my most anticipated book of 2025. In addition to having like a lot of the tropes that I really like, this world building was just really unique, which I appreciated. I would say I've never read a fantasy book quite like this one, and that's really hard to do considering how saturated the genre is at this point. And I don't say that negatively. I think a lot of people are like, oh, there's so many books of this kind now. There's something for everybody, so I would say the more the merrier. But with that, it's obviously hard to create something that's really a standout and really unique. And this is. So if you haven't read it yet and you like romantasy, go read this. Also, I would say this is, I think, labeled as YA, but it does not read YA. If that was what was holding you back, don't let it. That's Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. So there you have it, my top 10 books along with 8 honorable mentions for 2024. Thank you so much for watching, and drop a comment below if you've read any of these, if you have any on your TBR, or tell me what one of or all of your top 10 books were. I would love to hear from you. I'm just starting out again, so any feedback, anything like that is welcomed and encouraged. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time. Bye!